Homelessness is worsening over time.
If you don't have a home, you really can't focus on other parts of your life.
Our children are our future because we are the present.
You're one really bad day away from being homeless.
Folks that you walk past on the street, they're somebody's family member.
Housing, education, people. Those are game changers. We have the money, the intellect, the passion. We can do this.
Hi, my name is Hannon, and I'm the host of The Bells I Hear, an audio and video podcast that aims to raise awareness about the homelessness crisis in New York City and the complexity surrounding the issue. Thanks so much for tuning in. Today, we have Laura Lazarus joining us. Laura has over 30 years of experience in the New York City affordable housing landscape. Hi, Laura. It's a pleasure to have you on today.
Thank you so much. Really nice being here.
Yeah. I guess we could start off. Could you share a little bit about your background and what has sort of led you to co-founding Anthos Home?
Sure. I have spent my entire career in the world of affordable housing as an attorney, where I was representing nonprofits, rehabbing and building affordable housing. I also worked for a developer doing that kind of work around the country. I have also worked at New York City's housing department several times, so have the perspective from government. And then I also worked at several other nonprofits before I co-founded Anthos Home. At one of those nonprofits, we ran a women's mental health shelter, and another, I oversaw about 1,400 units of supportive housing scattered throughout New York City. And so I have a really kind of broad perspective on the need for affordable housing and how difficult it is to create and maintain. I co-founded Anthos Home with Leslie Abbey because we were trying to solve a very specific problem that was really making it hard for people who were leaving shelter to find housing, and trying to really match resources to the available supply.
Yeah, that's amazing. I guess what sort of propelled you into the realm of like affordable housing and kind of nonprofit work in that world?
It really started in college. In my senior year, I wrote a paper. I had spent the summer working at the Jersey Journal, which is a local paper in Jersey City. And from that, I grew interested in some of the housing politics that were going on in Jersey City at that time. So I ended up writing my senior thesis paper on housing issues in Jersey City and how they interacted with federal government. So that was my first entree into housing. And then that led me into my first job, which was with New York City Housing Preservation and Development Department, where I worked for 2 years right out of college. And so that was an amazing experience I was able to see a lot of different things through those 2 years. That was the beginning. So it's just very complex and very interesting work. Mm-hmm. And so fundamental, I think. That's the other piece of housing is that, and Anthos is focused on this as well, that if you don't have a home, you really can't focus on other parts of your life. You can't focus on the education for your kids. You can't focus on your own health needs. You can't focus on your own employment opportunities. If you're in an unstable housing situation, you really can't get on with the rest of your life.
Right. It sounds like the desire to help others was sparked really early in your life, and something that you're still committed to now, which is really amazing. And it sounds like Anthos Home is combating homelessness by partnering with government and social service agencies to help people with housing vouchers secure apartments more quickly. So could you explain a little bit more about how this works?
Sure. Let me back up a little and explain what the problem is that we're trying to solve.
Yeah.
Many people who are very low income can benefit from a program called a housing voucher. It's also called a rental subsidy. Some listeners and viewers may know it as Section 8. And what a housing voucher does is helps a family to afford a reasonable rent. So the government pays a portion of the rent so that the family only has to pay 30% of their income, which is considered a reasonable amount of their income. So whatever their income is, they would only have to pay 30% of that. So housing vouchers have been around for decades, since the 70s, and have been a proven tool at solving and ending homelessness and providing low-income families with stable housing for the long term. They also provide a guaranteed source of income for landlords as well. So they're really this fantastic partnership between government, and the real estate industry, as well as obviously the people who benefit from them. The problem is that it's very difficult to use these housing vouchers. 40% of housing vouchers went unused nationally last year.
Wow.
What we are trying to do is help to address that problem by matchmaking between landlords and tenants, and also help the process of getting somebody who has a voucher into permanent housing.
So you're saying that only 40% of housing vouchers were not used. Is that correct?
Yes.
Could you walk us through kind of maybe some of the key obstacles that people experiencing homelessness face when trying to secure permanent housing through these vouchers, and how come, there is that gap?
Yes. Housing vouchers can be difficult to use for a variety of different reasons. One is landlords find the process quite bureaucratic. Vouchers require that units meet certain inspection standards that they don't need to meet if they're renting to somebody in the marketplace. So that adds an additional level of review and time involved in the process. Some landlords also don't want to wait to go through the process of having the voucher approved, because they might be able to rent to somebody off the street right away and not have to make these repairs. Now, they should make the repairs. It's good for the unit. These are not excessive repairs, things like a smoke detector or the proper outlet. But again, they're just obstacles, and there's no one really helping them go through that process. There are some landlords that are skeptical about either the payment, is the payment going to happen, or about the future tenants themselves. And so what we're trying to do is solve for a lot of those issues by supporting the landlords and also supporting the tenants in that process.
That's amazing. I know that Anthos Home uses a flexible funding model. Could you share more about this approach?
Sure. So what we do is we use flexible funds and really have this mindset of get whatever you need done to make this happen. So we're very flexible about how we do this. So for example, we have relationships with landlords and brokers throughout New York City. So we develop those relationships. We explain to them what these voucher programs can mean to them, and we explain what the supports are that we'll offer them, both at the front end, at the beginning where they're processing a voucher, but also at the back end, because we stay throughout. Once somebody is housed, we stay for at least a year. So we're providing support both at the beginning and through at least 1 year of a tenant's residency.
Mm-hmm.
At the flexible funds can be used at the front end for things like repairs. So let's say the landlord just thinks they don't have time or they don't have the resources. We can help them either get those repairs done, or what we can help them by identifying what the repairs are, so it's easier for them to fix the things that need to be fixed. We also use those funds to help with application fees, moving costs, also transit for the families in shelter, because sometimes for them, it's hard for them to get to a unit. Or maybe they can take public transportation, but if they're going to go take a look at 2 units in the Bronx, that could be hours on public transportation. So we might help with the speed for that. We might help with, for example, early on, we had a unit. The landlord had agreed to make the repairs, but he wanted our staff person to be in that unit for 3 days because the super was refusing to open up and close the unit each day.
Wow.
So we offered the super $25 each day to open up and shut the unit, and he did it. And yes, he probably should have done it anyway, and it was part of his job, but really it was a very small amount of money, and it really saved a lot of time for everybody.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's that kind of decision-making that we do to really help move things along and use that flexible fund in that way. The other way that we use the flexible funding is once somebody has moved into their unit, we use that for if there are tenant-incurred repairs, if the tenant makes some kind of damage that needs to be fixed, we'll step in to help. We also pay for renter's insurance to support the tenant for that year. We also provide payment if there are payments missed. So if either a tenant might have an emergency and they weren't able to make their rent, or let's say they have lost income since they moved in, their rental share has to be reduced because they can't afford the rent that was approved. The government will allow that to happen, but it'll take a few months. So during those 2 months, we will make that payment to the landlord so that the landlord isn't missing a payment.
Hmm.
So that's some of the ways in which we use this flexible funding.
Wow. It sounds like Anthos Home provides just so much support, funding, and just resources to, people that have been experiencing homelessness, maybe not know how to navigate the housing voucher system, and kind of just like eases it for them, especially because it does sound like a very complex process where there can be a lot of obstacles and people may not know how to maneuver it, but kind of having, Anthos Home people that are willing to vouch for them, hold their hand through it can be very critical, I feel. Yeah, you guys are doing amazing work, is what it sounds like.
Yes, I can give you an example. We have a wonderful contract with New York City Administration for Children's Services. Under that contract, we work with young adults who are aging out of foster care, and we also help families who are in shelter right now, who are involved with ACS in child welfare, get out of shelter. A young adult who we had housed, she had been looking for housing for 7 months. Every time she contacted a landlord and she told them she had a voucher, she would not hear back. And this was a very motivated, organized college student. She presented very well, but landlords were just not interested. Once she was referred to us, we were able to actually match her to a unit quite quickly, move her in within a couple of months. And once she moved in, she discovered that her utility bills were really high. So we contacted the landlord for her. She had tried herself, but she wasn't getting anywhere. The landlord told us, that's not really my problem. So we hired an electrician to go out to the unit, and the electrician found that she was being charged for her neighbor's utilities.
Wow.
At that point, we explained to the landlord that he needed to fix this problem, and so he did, which is great. But that kind of interference or advocacy, I think, is hard for a tenant and maybe for these more vulnerable populations. It's just hard to talk to a landlord to get them to do the right thing. So they fixed that. We also helped to pay the arrears of the neighbor because that was not going to get resolved easily. And now she's actually graduated from our program. She's started a family. She's focused on her future. She's been able to do that because she doesn't have arrears, and she understands every voucher requires a recertification at the year level. So we've taught her how to do that. She understands her obligations under the lease. We always walk through with every tenant what the lease means, what their obligations are, what some of the house rules are, so that they understand that they also have obligations when they're moving into a unit.
Wow. That sounds like an amazing success story from Anthos Home, and I'm sure that there are many as well like it. In some ways, Anthos Home does exist in part because flaws in the system make it difficult for people experiencing homelessness to find secure and stable housing. I guess in a more perfect world, what does the housing voucher process look like where maybe we wouldn't need an organization like Anthos Home?
So I think the vouchers are this incredible resource, and I think New York City should receive a lot of credit for the amount of investment that they have done to the voucher program. There are multiple kinds of vouchers. There are federally issued vouchers, there are state issued vouchers, and in New York City, they have a program called City FEPs, which are city-funded vouchers. This is actually now the second largest rental subsidy program in the country. And the Department of Social Services has created this program in just a few years. So that's amazing. And last year, they moved 14,000 families out of shelter. So government has a huge role to play. But I think that by the nature of government and how governments work, that they need partners that are nimble and can make quick decisions and also act as an intermediary with landlords and with tenants. We like to think of ourselves as filling in the gaps to really help smooth that process. And ideally, somebody lands in shelter within a couple of weeks. We could show them a couple of units, 2 or 3 units, because we have a number of units identified for tenants out, here in New York. And then they would be able to pick one of those units. And then in an ideal world, the voucher would get approved within a couple of months. and then they would move in. And then obviously the goal is, of course, to reduce the shelter population and have many fewer people in shelter. And then that would be the dream, is to not have a demand for, there would be very few people who are homeless who wouldn't need this housing. But that is a bigger conversation in terms of
Right.
housing and affordable housing needs here in New York, which are tremendous. And not just in New York, they're really across the country.
Yeah. So you had sort of mentioned something previously that I also wanted to touch on, and that's that housing voucher allows individuals to only input 30% of their income to pay for rent. Now, according to city FHEPS, this can kind of last up to 5 years. Sort of wondering like how families can continue to maintain a household without a housing voucher, or sort of what happens after that point.
So in 2021, there was actually a rule change made to the City FEPS program, which allows for a renewal after 5 years. And families and individuals are able to keep their vouchers as long as they can show that they are earning no more than 80% of the area median income. And that's in line with how federal vouchers work as well. So that's a great ability that it allows families to earn additional income over time. And then hopefully by the time they meet that cap, they will be able to find an apartment that they can afford themselves.
Okay. That's amazing. Wow. So the New York City Council also passed a legislation, Introduction 878A, to eliminate the 90-day shelter rule. New York City is, obviously facing a pretty severe homelessness crisis, and they are reforming the city's rental assistance voucher program. And it appears that one of the benefits of the legislation is removing the barriers for accessing housing vouchers and in the process evictions. What are your thoughts around this legislation that passed?
So I'm not the expert on this particular piece of legislation. I think that the more vouchers, the more helpful it is. There are just a lot of people who are facing housing insecurity. So I think if the city has the resources to be able to provide this kind of support, it's really important, because I think if somebody, for example, this is helping them stay in their existing housing, then that obviously prevents a lot of disruption, which happens if you do enter the shelter system. So if the city were able to move forward with funding that, I think that would be a huge asset. The city already does pay for some amount of eviction prevention work through, I don't know how much, but they definitely provide some amount of support in that way. And I think the city council's legislation was about trying to expand that further. So I think the more is better. And I think it's a matter of resources from the city's perspective.
You have sort of been, in the affordable housing landscape for quite some time now. What are sort of, some of the changes that you've seen? Very broadly, I mean, it could be more specific changes, but, the affordable housing overall it seems like there isn't much of it nowadays, and it's been decreasing from what it looks like. But just how has it changed, and what have you witnessed or noticed?
So I feel like in most of my work, there's always a huge demand for quality, affordable housing, and that hasn't really changed. Although I think that there are more and more people who maybe work for the MTA or are working in a hospital, and unfortunately, they're not able to find affordable housing, and so they end up homeless. And that is a big change, in that there are more people in the shelter system who you would think who are working people that should be able to find a home that they can afford. And I think the affordability has become hard because incomes are not keeping pace with the amount and the cost of rent. And that's not unique to New York. It's something you see across the country. And the development so there's both the development of new affordable housing is very expensive, and the process can be quite complicated. There are tax credits that help to facilitate that. New York City and New York State provide a lot of resources in the development of new affordable housing. And then there also has to be a lot of investment into the existing affordable housing to make sure that it is preserved. And that is also expensive. So these are just very expensive activities. They also take a very long time. I'm on the board of a nonprofit, and we are working on a development for new congregate supportive housing in New York City, which is great. We have a wonderful partner. We plan to be working with New York City and the state. We started working on this maybe 3 years ago. We now have a site and we're doing the development work. And I think it's going to be at least another 3 years before we have a construction closing. So it's a very long timeline because there's such a demand for these resources. We could probably get to construction in a year if the money were available, but it's not. We kind of have to wait in line.
Right. That's interesting. You did touch on something that's very critical, which is that, like, the lack of affordable housing. There's a lack of affordable housing, yet income is sort of stagnating and it's hard for people to afford a home. There are people, within homeless shelters right now that have a job. And so, like, they are working, they are earning an income, but there is a lack of, affordable housing. I guess what sort of gives you hope, or like, I guess the first part of the question is, where do you see us heading, given that, New York City is becoming more expensive and people are still like working to earn income? Kind of where do you see us heading, and sort of, what gives you hope to sort of, wake up every day and like continue to fight for the, to close that gap in some ways?
New York does so much to try and help address this issue. First of all, they just passed the City of Yes, which is going to lead to the creation of thousands of units throughout New York City. That is fantastic. That's a huge win for the city and for people who are in need of housing. It's just a longer timeline, but those changes are really important. I think that you see kind of in every city, every council district, people who are advocating for more housing. The more that can happen, the more that is going to help address this issue. And then I think this commitment by New York City to devote so much of its capital to providing its own housing vouchers, which is very unique. Across the country, you don't see many, or maybe just a few, if any, municipalities generating their own housing vouchers that aren't federally generated. The commitment by the city to help people get out of shelter is quite tremendous. And I think that is what brings us hope. I think also we know in New York there's a very low vacancy rate. It's officially 1.4% based on the latest housing vacancy survey. And yet, in our work over the past couple of years, we have been able to really identify units that are willing, and landlords willing, to work with this program, so that because we're bringing a little bit of support to them, I think that we can continue to open up more housing stock to people who need it and help landlords understand how to participate in this program in a way that's beneficial to them. And obviously at the same time serving the people who really need the housing.
Yeah. It sounds like there are a lot of moving parts and pieces that need to work together in order to ensure that everyone is sort of satisfied, comfortable with the decision. So one last question: why do you think it is important for people, especially those not experiencing homelessness themselves, to care about this issue?
Housing is so important to a person's well-being and a family's well-being. And it just contributes to a better society when families are able to focus on their children's education, when they're able to focus on their own health needs. That's creating less pressure on the rest of government to support potentially other adverse effects. And then those people can become productive members of society instead of thinking about where they're going to sleep tomorrow. They can think about their job, or their helping their preschool kids get to school. There was a family that we started to work with last fall. It was a grandmother, her daughter, and 2 grandchildren. They had been looking for housing for nearly 2 years. Again, the grandmother had a physical disability, so it made it hard for her to walk. She needed to find a unit that was accessible. And every time they talked to landlords, they just said, we're not interested, or they wouldn't hear back. We, again, were able to find them a unit within a couple of months. And that meant that those 2 4-year-olds were able to start pre-K in the local school. The grandmother was able to start dealing with her other chronic issues in addition to her mobility concerns, and the mom was able to start looking for work. That's what we want for everybody.
Wow, that's amazing. Yeah, it's really all about, ensuring that it's not really a thought in the back of someone's mind that they may not have somewhere to sleep. Thank you so much for joining us, Laura. It was amazing having you on today.
Thank you so much for having me. I was really appreciate the opportunity to talk more about our work.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to today's episode. The episode was hosted by me, Hannah Nabraha, produced by Baron Noble Mello. The audio and video editing was done by Ilona Tuominen, and the music is courtesy of Diego Urquela. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to subscribe to The Bells I Hear and follow us on social media at The Bells I Hear to find more content and to spread the word. Thanks again. Till next time.